Hello, this is John W7DBO with the Field Radio Podcast. In this video, we have a recording from the Utah Digital Communications Conference held in Utah on February 15th, 2020. The Utah Digital Communications Conference is an annual one-day conference where amateur radio operators in the region meet together to learn about digital modes in the hobby. You can find more information about the conference at utah-dcc.org. In this presentation, we have Mitton KK7L, Kilo 7 Lima, speaking on amateur radio digital modes, something for everyone. Mitton is a member of the Utah DX Association. You can find in the show notes a link to the Utah DX Association and the conference website. At the conference website, you can download this presentation slide deck. If you are listening to this on your favorite podcast player, you can find the video version on YouTube at youtube.com/Field Radio Podcast. I hope you enjoy.
It's great to be here. I was here last year as well, and I think we had a really great time. I think this is our, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin just stepped out, I think it's the fourth year, right? Fourth year of the conference. I came to the first, and then I presented last year, and this one as well. It's great to be here again. I really love this conference because it gives you an opportunity to kind of do some deep dives into some of these emerging digital modes. I'm going to just first of all give a full disclosure. I'm an HF guy, okay? You won't see me with a rubber duck next on my belt, okay? But that's okay. We all have our little areas of the hobby that are fun. I do admit that I do get on VHF and UHF occasionally to check into my local Saratoga Springs emergency net. So I realize probably many of you, last time we had a raise of hands, I would say maybe a third of the attendees here are technician class. Great, welcome to the amateur radio community. I would encourage you all that are in that situation to upgrade to general and then eventually to extra class because the HF bands are a lot of fun. I'm going to turn on my laptop here and hopefully it'll perform just the way it did 20 minutes ago, and we'll have something to show you here. Let's give it a. I wonder if the projector went off because it timed out. We might do that. So while we're waiting for that to get going. Just a little more background on me. I got into the hobby in the 70s when I was in high school, and I had a lot of fun with that. I put up a little inverted V above I convinced my parents to let me put a little inverted V on top of the house there, and I had an old Johnson Ranger, where I could use CW and another receiver. If you go to QRZ.com and look at my QRZ page, you'll see some photos of me. It's kind of nostalgic, but I got into it, had a lot of fun with it, mostly CW, because when you're a little pistol like that with 100 watts, SSB was kind of hard. My Elmer was really into DXing, and at the Willamette Valley Radio Club there, DX Club. So I really got into it, had a lot of fun. I brushed off the logs. It's great to look back on that. I got worked all states when I was a kid, and then I kind of got out of the hobby like many of you do, I'm sure, have done over your lifetimes as well, where there's a period of time where life kind of catches up with you, with work and family and that sort of thing. But I got back into the hobby most recently when we moved to our home in Saratoga Springs. We found a lot right on the lake, and I'm thinking to myself, this is really nice takeoff angle right off the lake for DXing. I ought to probably get back into this. And sorry, I don't want to talk too much about me, but we've got to get the projector going. It'll happen. And so, I put up I'm in an HOA. How many of you are in an HOA where you have antenna restrictions? Oh, come on. Only a few of you? Wow, all right. The rest of you are pretty lucky because I can't put up a tower and a beam. It's not allowed. So I put a flagpole, a 24-foot flagpole in my backyard. And as before we laid the sod for the new home, I put conduit down to the flagpole area so I could run coax. And I also put 32 radials under the sod. So I had a really nice ground plane for that. And I fired that thing up, and I could hardly hear a whisper. I'm going, what's going on? I thought I'm going to buy the best coax I can get. I got LMR 400. Who's worked with LMR 400? Have you ever tried to put a connector onto that? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. So, it had been, decades since I'd held a soldering iron. So I put that, I did my best to put that together. I wasn't hearing anything. I got acquainted with the Utah DX Club, the Utah DX Association, went to the first meeting, and I started networking, and I'm going, hey guys, I should be able to do well with this, but I've got, really terrible SWR and stuff. And somebody says, first question, have you looked at your connectors? So if there's any wisdom I want to share with you, first off is if you're having trouble with your antennas, look at your feed lines and your connectors. That was a lesson learned. Slowly but surely, it's warming up. Oh, look at that. Okay, very cool. Last year I came here and we spoke about DXing. Today, and that was a lot of fun. I hope many of you were here last year for that conference. But today, what Kevin and John asked me to speak on today was a little more broad brush on amateur digital modes in general. As you're aware, this whole area of digital modes for the past couple of years has been rapidly evolving, and there have been literally hundreds of modes published about with different ways of communicating using digital modes. So what we're going to do today is kind of do more of a reconnaissance mission rather than a deep dive on any particular one mode. And I should just say I've also been re-elected as the president of the Utah DX Association. So this is going to be a little more heavily weighted on HF. And I realized, I'm going to go to the next slide here. I realized that as we look at the agenda here, later in the day there'll be a lot of discussion on the more VHF, UHF modes, especially repeater linkage and that sort of thing. So this morning what we will cover is I'm going to start out with a little bit of sort of a newbie background for many of you who may be kind of getting your feet wet with digital modes. We'll talk about the essentials of modulation and the theory of how many of these modes operate. I'm going to go through some of the variety of modes that are available as amateurs that have been published, and then kind of help you, based on your interest in the hobby, determine which modes are most appropriate for you and for those with whom you want to communicate. Now, what we're not going to cover is the elephant in the room. FT8, who operates FT8? A lot of us, right? If you want a deep dive on FT8, I'll talk about that later, because today, I just want to give a more of a broad brush about the digital modes, but we will talk a little bit about FT8 and its derivatives, especially JS8 call. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today as well. We're not going to talk a whole lot about how to set up your software. I'm going to touch on that just a little bit. I certainly don't want to get into any depth about some of the topics that are going to be discussed later today. All right, so when it comes to the wide world of amateur radio, I've just kind of categorized 4 sort of areas that, at least in my experience, working with various clubs around the state, my experience, most of us kind of fit into one of 4 categories, and most of us do more than one. But the first one, how many of you first got into ham radio because you wanted to get involved in public service? When you first, I figured that would be close to half of us. That's a very important aspect of our hobby. And so we're going to talk about public service and the use of digital modes there. How many of you like to tinker with designing antennas, or maybe, Arduino and, Raspberry Pis? Okay, that's cool. We'll talk about that a bit. All right, how many? Now this is religion, guys. How many are DXers? All right, very good. Good to see. Wannabe DXers, Roland, you are a DXer. Come on, admit it. I'm sure she'll attest that you're up early in the morning on 80 meters trying to catch those gray line openings to Europe, right? Okay. So some of us just really like to get on, BeehiveNet and, get on and rag chew and have some fun on HF. So that's a very important part of the hobby. And again, this presentation is going to be weighted a little heavily toward that. And then, of course, most all of us are on repeaters and that sort of thing. But, there's other aspects of VHF and UHF that are a lot of fun, too, that we're going to talk about. Meteor scatter, moon bounce, and that sort of thing. So what I tried to do here is sort of categorize some of the more popular digital modes in terms of their purpose and just kind of their and how they operate. So let's just go through the columns here briefly. Again, I showed the elephant in the room. Hopefully most of you are aware of K1JT, Joe Taylor, and his groundbreaking work he's done. He's a professor at Princeton. He and some of his colleagues in the amateur radio world have come up with some just really fantastic software for digital modes, especially over HF and for more, well, for weak signal propagation, essentially, is what it is. And their software is called WSJT. Now, it's open source, and so derivatives have been developed from the WSJT software, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The more common ones are FT8. FT8 is huge on the HF bands now, especially for DXing and for chasing awards such as worked all states and that sort of thing. FT4 is a new mode that came out about a year ago. That's a 4-tone mode rather than an 8-tone mode, and it's much faster and it's designed for contesting. Whisper, how many remember my discussion last year about Whisper? I had an antenna up here and we were trying to listen to some really weak signals. That is such a fun mode. It's a one-way communication, but you get your reports back over the internet, which is really cool. JS8 call, we'll talk about that a little bit today. That's really the one derivative that has taken off like crazy. Do we have any JS8 call operators here? A few? Dabbled with it a little bit. I just started playing with it. I've been having a ball with that. And then there's some other ones, JT9, especially JT65, which originally started out. That was Joe Taylor's first software that he came out with for moon bounce, for Earth-Moon-Earth communications. And then the next two are for meteor scatter on VHF and UHF. So that really isn't a category all by itself because it just allows some very fantastic propagation under difficult conditions. The next group I call binary transfer, and that's when you want to send actual data. I want to send a spreadsheet, right? I'm working a race, for example, and we want to have everyone that came through checkpoints as they come through. I want to send that spreadsheet off so everyone gets it. We're in an area without cell phone coverage. Amateur radio to the rescue, right? So that's the binary transfer. Probably the most important one on all of this is Pactor, which is a third-party SCS. They're based in Germany. We'll talk about that later. Pactor is probably the de facto standard, not in the amateur community so much, but in the maritime community especially. Every ship has Pactor modems. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Some of the other ones you're quite familiar with, Packet and APRS with repeaters and so on, D-Star. And then we're going to talk about Winlink modes a little bit as well. I hope many of you are familiar with Winlink. We'll get into a little more deeper dive into that in a moment. There's digital audio, D-Star, DMR, Fusion. How many have heard of Radio Mondale? Any shortwave listeners out there? That is really a cool mode. I must admit I haven't used it yet, but many of the broadcasters now on HF are using it. It's a digital FM quality signal that they can put over a narrow band. Next is keyboard chat, text transfer. I'll start with CW, the original digital mode, right? Great way to rag chew, that sort of thing. RTTY is extremely popular. PSK continues to be a big performer. Olivia is still popular with ARES and emergency nets, especially on HF. And then the other one would be like, image transfer. There's slow scan television. There's amateur TV on the UHF bands for high-speed television. There's an old one called Hellschreiber, now called Field Hell. There's contests that actually still use this mode. I have not dabbled with that one. Let's look a little bit about some of the basics. Now, if you already know this stuff and you start looking at your phone and checking text messages, I totally understand. There's some old timers here. So the next 5-10 minutes, we're going to go through some of the real basics about how digital modes operate. So I have a little teeter-totter here. There's a trade-off between bandwidth, throughput, and the signal-to-noise ratio, right? So if you're in a very weak signal to noise ratio, let's say you've got heavy static, the signal coming in from the other side is in the static, really low noise, then there's no way you're going to be able to send a large data packet, within a second or two, right? Well, especially if you're bandwidth constrained, which we all are on HF band especially, right? So if you look at the, I think I have a pointer here, right? I guess it'll work. Let's see if this works. The red button's the pointer, maybe? The bottom? I don't need it. You can all see it, right? We're all familiar with, if you have your technician class, you know about a sideband, right? So you have the carrier, the lower, the upper sideband. So you chop the carrier off, you chop the lower sideband off. All digital modes are on what? Upper sideband, right? What was that, except RIDI? Oh yeah, maybe. That's probably true. Anyway, all the newer digital modes all run on upper sideband. So you have about 2.6 kilohertz to work with, right? 2600 hertz to work with in this subband. And so depending on how much of that bandwidth you use is going to depend on what your theoretical throughput should look like, given the same signal to noise ratio conditions. So you may recall last year we talked about the whisper mode, and many of you probably use whisper now. It's getting very, very popular. But that occupies 6 hertz. It barely uses any. Oh, look at that. That's what you meant. Oh, cool. Ha ha ha. Look at that. All right, cat, dance. There we go. It uses 6 hertz. It uses barely any bandwidth at all. It takes almost 2 minutes to send like a very short message of, here's my grid square location, here's my call sign, go. Basically, that's it. So as a result, you look at whisper mode, and it can decode as low as 32 dBs under the noise floor, right? Some of these other modes, FT8, which is extremely popular, you move up here a little bit further, where FT8 can decode about 15 to 20 dB under the noise floor. And if any of you have used these whisper modes and so on, I can turn on my receiver and just listen to the whisper mode frequency. I don't hear anything at all. I just hear a little bit of static, right? And I have a very low noise floor, fortunately, where I live. I don't hear anything at all. And then there it is, boom. Here's, KB2AF or whatever in Pennsylvania or in New Jersey that just sent a whisper message. I'm like, I don't hear that, but my computer does. It's really quite amazing. And then there's RIDI, Pactor, and so on. As you move up, like Pactor, for example, it takes up the entire subband. It's as if you're rag chewing on upper sideband. You're using the whole thing. Whereas like with FT8, you can have 100 QSOs going on with FT8. Why? Because it's very narrow, and they can be almost directly on top of each other, and you can still decode it. So that's kind of the trade-off. Upper sideband for the HF modes, and of course FM for the VHF, UHF modes, especially packet, which is probably the most common one on FM. Next, we're going to talk about modulation. So modulation basically is a process by which some characteristics of a carrier wave is varied in accordance with a modulating or a message signal. So we all know the sine wave, the carrier wave. Well, we're going to interrupt that. The earliest way of interrupting it, of course, was with Morse code, right? It's called continuous wave. Why? Because the wave is continuous. We're just simply interrupting it so that we can put our dits and our DAWs together. And somebody, on the other hand, a skilled operator, can hear those dits and DAWs and get the message. So that really was the original digital mode. Again, it's amplitude modulation, but we're just simply interrupting the carrier without any modulation whatsoever. It's a continuous wave. The next one that became popular was the frequency shift keying way of modulating. And the classic one there is RTTY, radio teletype. And here I have a kind of a pictorial of what that looks like off of a pan adapter. But it's basically two tones, right? And you're shifting the frequency from one to the other And that's how we're modulating that signal. And on the other side, the radio teletype machine in the good old days, or today your modern HF rig would take that from the computer, and off you go. You now get, hey Bob, how you doing today, right? So that's frequency shift keying. Then along came phase shift keying. And what phase shift is, and again, remember digital, it's all about ones and zeros. That's all we're doing here, right? So what we do is we interrupt the phase of the signal. So rather than a perfect sine wave, what happens is as you're getting from the 0 to the 1 or the 1 to the 0, we interrupt the phase. And I think this is a good pictorial I found out on the internet to show how that works. So if you look at PSK31, which is still a very popular mode, or PSK63 is somewhat popular still too, that's all about interrupting the phase of that carrier. It's nice because then you can pack a lot of these PSK signals into a very into one bandpass. Again, just like FT8, similar. It's a little wider than FT8, but you can pack a lot of signals into your PSK waterfall. We'll get to that in a minute. Hope I'm not boring too many of you. I know a lot of you know this, right? How many of this is like new? Yeah? Okay, cool. All right, so we'll get back to the elephant in the room. This is a PSK Reporter. I'll pull up that website in a minute. PSK Reporter is a way for people who are listening on the internet, have internet connectivity to their radios. They can report what types of signals they're hearing. Well, as you see, about 98% of the traffic now is FT8 on the HF bands. Now, this is just a snippet in time. If I had taken this last weekend when the CQ Worldwide RTTY contest was operating, RTTY would have been way up the food chain here, but it still would have been way below FT8. Had I had the foresight, I would have taken a snapshot at that point. But as you see, the more common ones are these, WSJT modes, PSK31 still in there, RTTY, and so on. But anyway, again, I'm not going to focus on FT8 today because I want to make sure everybody's aware that there are a lot of really great, useful digital modes out there, and we're going to talk about some of these. All right, so many of you raised your hand about public service. Let's talk about the modes that are most commonly used for public service. Now, I'm not talking analog mode where you're just on your handy talkie, hey, he's bleeding, what bandage do I put on? We're talking about digital modes here. So again, sort of the granddaddy of them all is Pactor. The Pactor started out as open source, Pactor version 1 decades ago. From there, a company in Germany, SCS, that makes these modems here, they're wonderful modems. They've kind of expanded on that and developed their own sort of proprietary Pactor, starting with Pactor 2, 3, and now they're up to Pactor 4, which theoretically has the maximum capacity of throughput you can achieve in a 2600 hertz band segment, or bandwidth.
For some of us old people, how would that compare with a Camtronics, for example?
Great question. So Camtronics, they started out as a Pactor 1. There's a cottage industry of these modem manufacturers that came out years ago. And then Camtronics continues to offer, I think today as well, a Pactor modem. I think they're up to Pactor 2 or something, which I believe is also open source. I'm sorry I don't have all the details on it, but Camtronics also did some other digital modes back in the day that kind of faded off into obscurity in favor of Pactor. And then the other two modes, well, the next one that came out was Winmore, I have here as well. That became very popular because it got integrated as part of the Winlink software. How many of you are familiar with Winlink? Okay, so many of you are. So Winmore came out as a bundle as part of the development team, and that kind of put some of those Camtronics and other modes into obscurity because now you could accomplish essentially the same thing just using your PC sound card rather than needing a standalone modem. But before I leave Pactor, the really cool thing about Pactor is that because the modems communicate with each other, you've got all that processing is offloaded onto the modem. And as conditions change, even like if there's frequency shifts on the other side, you can have Pactor modems running you can hardly hear the signals, kind of like I'm talking about with whisper mode, but this time with data. And you can actually move the VFO, a half a kilohertz, and the modems will say, oh, we just moved, let's figure it out. And they just adjust. They're really quite amazing. But with that, of course, comes a price. They're like, $1,200. Okay? But if you look at, the maritime industry has taken this up for decades. They've been relying on backdoor. Every sailor out at sea in his little sail ship and yacht, they all have backdoor. And many of them get their ham licenses so they can hook in with Winlink and send messages home to loved ones and that sort of thing when they're out at sea. I want to talk about a couple other Winlink modes here. Again, WinMore was the original mode. That's being replaced by RDOP. And RDOP is now bundled as part of Winlink in the most recent ones. Yes, you have a comment?
On the CS backdoor, they recently released a piece of software allowing you to actually monitor the
Okay, let's wade into that a little bit. So there is a petition in front of the FCC by New York University. It's been out for about a year or so, where they're petitioning the FCC saying, hey, let's get backdoor off the ham bands. Why? Because it effectively encrypts the communication. And of course, we're not allowed to encrypt communication. So the league looked into it, Winlink looked into it, and said, you know what? You kind of have a point here. Backdoor 4 especially, which is not allowed on the ham bands because of a very old, outdated baud rate limit that was put in back in the 90s, but I won't digress on that. But anyway, the Winlink organization says, you know what, let's make this transparent. So if you're a US licensed ham and you connect to a Winlink node somewhere and send an email, that gets posted for anyone to read. You just simply log in as a Winlink user and you can read it. So there's full transparency on the Winlink side of things. Or if you're a US licensed Winlink node operator, even if it's a foreign station coming in, then that gets available for public view. And then SCS also jumped into the fray and said, look, here's a piece of Linux software you can run on, I think it's an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi. And with that, you can actually decode what's going on. So I think that tempest in the teapot is pretty well settled. The FCC hasn't ruled on it yet. And the league, their position on it is, look, no other country in the world has a regulation that says effectively encrypted. What does that mean, right? We're going to have difficulty because this is a worldwide community of hams. So anyway, that's kind of where that is. Yes, it is possible to decrypt backdoor. It's a little more difficult than any of the other digital modes, however. Yeah. Yeah, it's an acknowledgement system. So you send, you send, you know how it is, it's like the old modems when you dialed up, right? You'd send the data, they'd acknowledge back with the checksum, got it, yes, that matches, okay, here's the next one. If it didn't match, I'll send it again. The challenge there is if you don't get the X, you don't know if, you can't necessarily read the first packet that came out, so. All right. So RDOP is the next replacement for that. It's a narrower bandwidth mode, but then again, remember, the narrower the bandwidth, typically speaking, the better you're going to be able to decode at the other end. It's slower, but RDOP and WinMore have been, again, it's totally free, part of the Winlink software. VARA is a new mode that came out as an adjunct, as an add-on to Winlink by EA5 HVK in Spain. What he did essentially is took what goes on in backdoor and he put it into a sound card mode. So as it'll intelligently determine, as conditions deteriorate, if I need to go from, say, 16 tones down to 8 tones down to 4 and so on. He has this little description here of how he does it. VARA, I've used VARA and I'm super impressed with VARA. He does require, I think, like $30 or something for the software. You can download it for free, give it a shot, but it's disabled in terms of its faster speeds. But you can give it a try, log in, check to Winlink nodes. I think you'll have a lot of fun with VARA. And all of the Winlink nodes now have VARA as part of the software right built into it. And there's also a VARA FM version up to 9600 baud. I have not played with that, but I've read some reviews that it's working quite well, and it perhaps is more robust than what we have on Packet. Okay, so enough of the kind of the background. Let's talk about, again, public service. I want to kind of share with you a little experience that I had this year. So if you were here last year when we talked about DXing, I explained how digital modes are really taking off for DXpeditions and DXing. And I've been on a couple of sort of mini DXpeditions over the years. I have a client in Australia, and so what I do is when I go down there, I try to make it a point to visit this little island nation called Tuvalu, which is about 2 hours out of Fiji. It's a population of 12,000 people. That's the entire country. They all live on these little atolls. You see that? Just barely sticking out over the ocean. And so for DXing, it's a pretty rare entity. It's like number 70-ish on the club log list of rare entities. So you go there and you set up your antennas and your radio, and you're suddenly everybody's friend, right? And it's a lot of fun working the pileups. Well, when I was there, I got to know, of course, to get my license, I had to walk into the telecom bureau, and I got my license, got to know them. And they said, hey, we use HF radios all over these islands, right? Our telephone system is terrible. It goes over satellites. They're very unreliable. And so there are HF radios on all the islands. You're telling me I can send email? Really? I said, yeah, you can do that. And so the dominant church there, the Church of Tuvalu, about 90% of the population are Christian members of this church. And I had a nice sit down, and you see their little HF radio there with a little microphone at their church headquarters. And they said, yeah, all of our pastors have these out on the remote islands. And I said, well, let's get them modems. They're like $1,200. Oh, how do we do that? So they actually applied for a grant, and they got it from the government of Canada. They granted them 50,000 Canadian dollars to put Pector modems on all the islands, and they even paid for my flight. So I came out there last June, and I went out there and I got them all trained up. I didn't go out to the remote islands because that's like I'd be spending 2 or 3 months to get there. There's ferry service that's very infrequent, but I taught the main guys how to do this, how to set it up. We got them amateur radio licenses from our friend down the street at the government building. We got them marine licenses so they could operate. They're actually operating on the marine bands for this. I went to the Winlink organization. Hey, I got this project. And they gave me the blessing to go ahead and use it on the marine bands. And it was really cool because now they're able to send little emails and stuff back and forth between the pastors. And they've got a backup means of communications that they can run off 12 volts. And it's really cool. We were able to budget for a Panasonic Toughbook, refurbished laptops. I got to tell you, you're at the equator there. The salt there is murder on electronic gear. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. So again, I hope this will inspire you to think, I've had some good experience with amateur radio. Maybe I can help. Some of you may go serve missions out in the remote regions of Africa or something. Think about how you can utilize your knowledge and experience to help others around the world. Some of the other modes that you could that have come into play with with disaster recovery and so on. Who had ever thought slow scan television could be utilized in a disaster? Well, it's interesting. The Nepal earthquake in 2015, some of the first images that came out were actually ham radio slow scan television. I don't know if you knew that. The Nepalese radio club at the university there was the first really to spring into action and start getting some communications out of the area. Unfortunately, they didn't have any experience with digital modes other than slow scan television. So it was all over SSB. Okay, here's what we need for relief supplies and that sort of thing. And interestingly, their first contacts were on 15 meters SSB with a ham that's stationed at one of our bases in Afghanistan. Was how they originally started getting the message, some of the communications out. We all know about, Olivia. Don't forget about Olivia. I think many, I know like the Treasure Valley ARES network up in Boise uses Olivia on HF for their weekly nets and that sort of thing. That's a great, robust communication protocol. There's forward error correction. It's an excellent mode. Of course, there's lots of flavors of Olivia. You got to make sure you've set to the right one. I think Olivia 500 is what they use up there. And we all know about packet APRS digipeters. I won't spend any time on that. I went to a conference once, I don't think it was here, it was at another one, where there's a group of amateurs that every year go up to the mountaintops when they run that 100-mile race along the Wasatch. And they're able to use, anybody doing that? Oh, you're doing that, okay.
About 30 years I've done it.
Yeah, it's really cool how you're able to use high-speed television to do some of that and using UHF. That's amazing. All right. Another thing, okay, now let's talk a little bit about tinkering and learning and that sort of thing. We talked about this last year as well, but if you're experimenting with antennas and propagation, there's no better way to do that than some of these modes like Whisper and this new JS8 call. I have a photo here of a little Whisper transmitter that you can buy off the shelf, where you can program in there your call sign and your Maidenhead, and you can just plug it in and let it run and let it send Whisper beacons as you're testing your antennas. It's really quite cool. Here's an example of, I told you I have a flagpole vertical, but I also set up an end-fed 80-meter half-wave antenna. I wanted to see which one would perform better. And with minutes, I had these reports. So which one works better on 80 meters? The flagpole or the end-fed? Clearly, I'm getting better signal reports on the half-wave end-fed, right? So, or if you're working on a a beam or something, you can head it that direction to see what reports you get from those areas. I know a lot of us like to play around with Arduino and other things. Here's a fun little project that my friend Jared Smith did up in Cache Valley. He's done some high altitude balloon projects with the local 4-H club that his daughter's in. And what they do is he built a little controller there with tiny little solar. He can't have much of a payload, right? Can't put a lot of weight up in these things. So he didn't have enough payload for a battery. So this thing would send out Whisper beacons just during the day. But darn it, if only at 1/100th of a watt, okay, he was able to get reports as far away as Australia with that balloon. And what he also had a GPS in there where part of the payload on the transmission included the grid square where it's currently located, so he could track the balloon. Pretty cool, huh? There are loads of things you can do with digital modes if you're into this sort of Arduino Pi and Raspberry Pi and that sort of thing. This emergency gateway you can build. You basically buy a kit from, I forget who it is, but this is kind of a cool little thing. What it will do is you just put a little Wi-Fi antenna onto this thing, and if there's a disaster, everybody has a cell phone, right? But the cell tower's down. What do I do? You can tell people, look, just go to, log into this Wi-Fi network, right? Register, and you can send a message out using this little web interface that's built into it. The person can send the message out. It'll go out over the HF transceiver through Winlink. To get it back, you have to go to the ham and say, hey, did I get my message? But at least you've got a way to, it's kind of a neat little project that he's got going. You can do APRS trackers using Arduino. This is a slide from last year. You can obviously have a lot of fun with DXing, with RIDI and FT8 and that sort of thing. Don't forget PSK31, it's still a very solid performer. JS8 call, let's spend a couple of minutes on this. It sounds like a few of you have toyed with this, and there's one person here I'm going to have a shout out to in just a minute. But this is really a fun mode. FT8 is so robust, right? Beautiful error correction, but you can only send a little small packet every 15 seconds, right? So what JS8 call does is you can start typing away, and it'll chunk it up into 15-second packets, and maybe it'll take a minute to send your short sentence, but it'll get out there. Then the other person now has their 15-second chunks and that sort of thing as well. It also allows you to relay messages. So you could send say I want this to be relayed to so-and-so, he'll take it and it'll automatically send off to the next station. So there's some nice emergency communications features built into it. And what I really like about it is you can send out what's called a heartbeat. So if I'm on the JS8 call on, say, 20 meters, whatever, I can say, send a heartbeat. And what will happen is all the other stations listening, if they hear me, they'll send an immediate signal report back to me, which is really cool. I don't have to have an internet connection now to see how well I'm propagating. All right, is George here? Okay, shout out to George. George contacted me before the conference. He came up from Cedar City. Thank you for making the trip. George is using JH8 call on 2 meter SSB mode, where he's able to put this little net together. He's getting, again, I talked about the heartbeat. He's getting reports from some pretty good distances. Anything else you want to add to that, George?
No, it's the one in the center is about 7,500 feet. It doesn't have a good view this way, but
okay.
Long distance ones are from the mountaintop one. The farthest south there, that's
Quartzite, wasn't it?
de-armored quartzite. Right?
Yeah.
And
the guy in California has like a nice directional beam set up, right?
yeah, he's almost to EME. Yeah.
Yeah.
500 watts and 12.
500 watts to an array. Yeah, that'll get you some
That's
good.
one way he hasn't heard.
Can't hear you, but
The mountaintop one is a pair of only and loops, so it's there's no.
right. Anyway, what a great way to use JS8 call. I never thought of JS8 call to be on VHF frequencies, but that's really cool. We're running a little short on time. I'm going to kind of skip through these quickly. FSK 441, that's built into the Joe Taylor software. That's commonly used for meteor scatter, typically on 2 meters. JT65, that was his original mode, as I said, for EME moon bounce. And here we are, and I see Randy is here. This came right off his QRZ page. Randy, WI7P. What are you up to now? Well over 50 DXCC over the moon, right? Oh, he's going to look it up. 56 DXC. Let's give him a hand. As you can see, a kilowatt to that kind of an array is what's needed to bounce a signal off to the moon and get it onto, to the other side. So that's another mode that's really, really, really cool. I want to talk a little bit about coexisting the various modes. We got 5 minutes?
20.
What was that?
We have 20.
We have 20? Oh.
10 after the hour.
When do you want me to finish? Oh, 10 after. Oh, okay. I'll slow down a little bit. So, as especially FT8 has become really popular, right? But as these digital modes are becoming more and more used, a concern that I've had is, okay, well, what happens when we kind of run out of spectrum here, right? Are we going to run out of spectrum? Because it's not a matter of if, but when multiple channels of FT8 are just going to have to start popping up. We're already seeing it. For example, a DXpedition will go to some rare country. They don't go to the FT8 frequency, all right? They run FT8 on some other frequency, so they don't QRM what's going on with the normal traffic on FT8. So they'll set up what's called fox hound mode, where they're the hounds and we're all the foxes. No, we're all the hounds trying to catch the fox. Anyway, whatever it is. And so if you look at the passband, what the foxhound mode does is it takes the bottom, I think it's the bottom 1,000 hertz of it, and that's reserved for the DX. Nobody should be transmitting in there. So we can get a nice clear signal. We can hear the DX. Everybody else up to 2600, right? We're all calling him. And so what happens is the software will automatically, as the DX decodes you, he'll click 1 or 2. Let's say he clicks 3 of you to respond to. When it's his turn, every 15 seconds, he'll say to all 3 of those with different carriers, okay, KK7L, I've got you, so-and-so, here's your signal report, all at the same time. Okay. Anyway, that's foxhound mode, and it works really, really well. The DX is able to make multiple contacts at the same time that way and get more people in the logbook in the limited time that they're on some godforsaken rock in the middle of the Atlantic someplace, right? So that's the mode. Well, I got thinking, well, there's probably going to be more demand now for additional subbands for FT8. How's all that going to work when we have, for example, the RTTY contest last weekend? This is off my IC 7300. I mean, just look at this. Do you see all that? I mean, this is wall-to-wall RTTY during the contest, right? And so what happens with these little subbands where we've got FT8, where we've got whisper and that sort of thing? Well, what I found in tuning around, the contesters now are avoiding the PSK frequencies. For example, if you look here, it's kind of hard to tell, but right at 14070, right? That's where people like to do keyboard chat on PSK mode. I didn't hear any RTTY stations there at all, okay? But above that, oh, and I didn't hear any, I did hear a few faint ones right on the FT8 frequency, all right? But the whisper frequency, forget about it. I'm parked right here on the whisper frequency. Look at this. I mean, this is, first of all, you won't be able to see the whisper. You barely see it on your pan adapter anyway, right, on your scope, because it's such a weak mode. So look at this, right in the middle of all this mayhem of the RTTY contest going on. By the way, I'm not faulting contesters. I'm a contester. I love contesting. And I don't fault them. I'm happy that most of them stayed off of the FT8 and off the PSK frequency. But yeah, nobody cared about the whisper frequency. Look at that. I had 20 dB over 9 signals just pounding right on that frequency. So I thought, why don't I just send out a little whisper beacon to see what happens, right? 10 watts. Look at this. Wow. I was received as far as China on 10 watts in the middle of the RTTY contest. A guy on Maui gave me, a dB minus 12. That's not bad for 10 watts to my flagpole, right? So it got me thinking that, as these digital modes become more refined and the state of the art and the technology improves, it's going to be easier and easier for us to coexist multiple digital modes given the limited band segments that we have in the amateur radio spectrum. So I'm hopeful. But I'm also hopeful that this new ARRL band, how many are aware that the ARRL is modifying the band plan? Okay, so this is the final draft, and I've given you just the example of 20 meters here. By the way, all these slides are going to be made available on the conference website, I believe, right, when we're done. But you're welcome to take photos. But anyway, so here's just 20 meters, which is probably the most popular HF band in the amateur radio spectrum. So as you're all aware, we have CW only down here, but actually CW everywhere. But the digital modes are restricted currently from usually the bottom 25 kcs up to the single sideband area, right? Which in the United States, that means we have all the way up to 14150 for digital modes. But in reality, what happens? Let's take 20 meters, for example. The Canadians, they get all the way down to 14100 on sideband. So you'll hear good old boys up in Canada and their networks on 14107 or 5 or something like that. And do we really want to QRM them? Probably not a good idea, right? Most DX, they're operating down there. We can't call them on sideband, but there's a lot of sideband going on there. So and then we have this segment here called ACDS, automatically controlled digital stations. So the regulation kind of is a little unclear in terms of, we're supposed to have attended operations. Well, what are repeaters? Is somebody up on Farnsworth Peak all the time monitoring that thing? No. Well, what about in the HF bands? Well, we have Winlink nodes that are out there, ready, and especially the ones in the West Coast. They've just got to be up 24/7 to help these mariners, get their traffic in and out of the Pacific and that sort of thing. Or on the East Coast, same thing. So there's sort of this thought of, well, the automatically controlled digital stations, the ACDS, the FCC does permit limited spectrum for that on all of the bands. And it has to be narrow bandwidth. So that's where WinMore, right, and this new RDOP come into play, where we have, yes, we're taking just a narrow segment, and we do have, automatically controlled stations for the purpose of digital transmissions. Well, we're completely out of space for that now with the popularity of Winlink. And let's face it, with the popularity of, say, JS8 call and that sort of thing, that's automatically, you're going to send a signal report out, right? So this is the new band plan, and I certainly hope that this takes place. This will give us lots of elbow room now for ACDS. Let's kind of slice up the sub-bands just a little bit here. Again, I'm just going to focus on 20 meters because that's probably the most popular band, especially for chasing awards and that sort of thing. Let's look at what we see here on my scope. I just kind of snipped this last night. We've got some, little different. I'm sorry I don't have audio. If you Google, audio JT65, there are places you can click and hear what it sounds like to help identify what you're hearing as you're dialing around. But so here we have kind of an interesting looking squiggly signal that extends for, for about 30 seconds or so. Here we have a bunch of packed signals together, and they stop, and then they go, and they stop, and they go. I think you know where I'm going with this. Just don't shout out what you think it is yet. There's a little quiz here. Here we have a little segment where it stops and goes and stops and goes and stops and goes much more frequently. Here's somebody that just fired up. I'll have to tell you what that one is because I listened to it. And here we have just this little guy out here that just keeps going and going and going and going and going. So, can you identify what those modes are? How about this first one? What's going on there? What is it? Very good. And why the long squiggly line? Yeah, it's phase shifting. So there's a lot of this phase shifting going on, and it takes up a fair bit of bandwidth, right? And the guy's kind of long-winded. He's saying, hey, Bob, how's the weather over there? I don't know. Was that you? Guilty as charged? Is that what that is? All right, so what about this next one here? This is one where we've got gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of people, and every 15 seconds it stops for a couple. Well, every 13 seconds it stops for 2 seconds. What's that? All right, very good. All right, let's take a look at the next one. This one's kind of hard to tell because as you notice here, there's a little gap. Do you see that little gap between what's going on in FT8? And this is just a little bit higher up, but it also is, any idea what that is? It's almost a dead, that's your JT65 up there, okay? Now, I could be wrong. This could just be another FT8 signal way at the top end of that bandpass. I don't know, but I just wanted to be instructive to show that, yes, guys, there still is JT65. JT65 takes much longer time to send, and you end up having about a 4 or 5 minute QSO before it's done. But as Randy will attest, it's the way to go for moon bounce. I don't know why that is, man. Randy, is there any particular reason why? It's still the common mode, isn't it, on moon bounce? Yeah. All right, very good. How about this one? Not Olivia. Olivia would be more like keyboard, so it might be longer. Yeah, I heard it. It's stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, stop, go every 7 seconds. It's FT4. Very good. Oh, I'm sorry. FT4 is further out. I'll go ahead and I'll finish this out. 14078 is the JS8 call, and JT9 is also on that frequency, but I think that's pretty well a dead mode now. I mean, some people may still use it. And this is hard to tell, but JS8 call is also on, off at 15-second intervals. Well, good. You guys are getting the hang of this. All right. Now, what's that one? What is that? That is a beacon. What mode? You can hardly hear it. It's barely a whisper. Okay.
Give us a hint.
Yeah, that's your whisper beacon out there. And that's why, as you can see, the RIDI contesters just kind of jammed. I mean, they just were wall to wall in that area. Who cares about the whisper beacon? I mean, whatever. So yeah, kind of fun, huh? When you have a scope like that, it's fun to kind of see what's going on in the band and take a closer look. And as you start dialing around, you'll hear these different weird and wonderful sounds. Oh, I was going to tell you, this one right here, I did tune out to it, and I recognized it. It was a pack door signal. Somebody was using Winlink and pack door there. recycled a slide from last year. I said I wasn't going to go too deep into setting up and that sort of thing, but this is kind of a useful slide to describe if you want to get into digital modes. Well, what do I need? As we learned from George, you don't need to have a general class license. Technician is fine if you want to use JS8 call on 2 meters, for example. But generally what you need is any rig, and even UHF rigs, VHF rigs will have this with an accessory socket in the back. This just happens to be one from an ICOM, an older ICOM. Oh, this actually came out of my project for the marine radios in Tuvalu. But you basically need to have your ground, you need to have your send and your modulation, and then your audio in, audio out. And most rigs will have a jack like that. To be able to, to key the rig, modulate. You need some kind of a interface. This is a very common one, the Signal Link USB. Mountain West Radio makes a really cool one that includes Bluetooth, so that you don't have to be by your rig. You can be out in the kitchen and working the world if you want. Kind of fun. But you do need. But new rigs today, most all of them have an internal sound card. So then all you really need is a USB cable. And a little bit of time on YouTube, learning experience of others how to set the parameters. There are a lot of great tutorials out there you can look at. For the IC7300, which I have, that took a little tweaking. There's lots of software out there. Most of it is free. WSJT is the most common one for these new modes that Joe Taylor's come up with. And I would encourage you to download that and set it up. And if you're a little timid about transmitting, great. Well, then just listen to the whisper beacons that are coming through, or listen to the FT8 and that sort of thing that's going along. There's a great little software called JT Alert that hooks into WSJT that helps you keep track of which contacts you still need for DXCC or worked all states and that sort of thing. JTDX is another one. It's free. It's a derivative of the open source Joe Taylor software here. Ham Radio Deluxe. JS8 call, we talked about that as well. And don't forget FL Digi. It's still a popular way to get onto the PSK modes. Olivia, and even RTTY. It's not ideal for RTTY because you want frequency shift keying where your rig is actually transmitting on the different frequencies. But with FL Digi, you can use audio. Does that make sense to you? The different tones. It's not quite as robust as using actual frequency shift keying, but you can do that as well. A couple of common setup. This is also from last year. We talked about that. Look, guys, if you're going to use your computer and the radio together, you want to ferrite everything, okay? You don't want that RF getting into your PC. It'll mess things up. Be careful you're not over-modulating. Hold the transmit frequency if you're running FT8 or these digital modes from Joe Taylor, so you're not jumping onto the same frequency that you're answering. And then here's my final slide. Let's talk about some resources. Your first resource is just your local club. I hope you're all members of a local club, be it Davis County or Utah Valley or wherever you happen to live. I know in Cedar City you got a great club going on down there too. Join your club. There are lots of people that are willing to help Elmer you, so to speak. I want to make a plug for the Utah Valley Ham Fest. That's coming up in May. The Utah Valley Club is putting that on. It's now an ARRL sanctioned full statewide event, so please put that on your calendars. I don't have the website, but Google it. They just have a website up and running now. The ARRL, the league has a great book called Get on the Air with HF Digital. I must admit I haven't read it, but I've read some good reviews. It's a great way to get started. Here's another little PDF you can download from a guy in New Zealand. It's a really great book. And hey, you're all invited, but only 30 can come. I'm going to have a little deep dive at my house on Leap Day. So if you're interested in learning more about, the focus is going to be the WSJT software. We're also going to have a little fun with the JS8 call. I have a room downstairs where we have a music studio. It'll hold about 30 people. So if you want to come, jump on the Utah DX Association website. It's on the calendar and sign up. We'll love to have you there. It's free for UDXA members. I'd just like a little small donation to help cover the bagels and stuff. If you're not a member, great. Thank you all. It's been a lot of fun presenting this to you today.